Here's my sermon from Solomon's Porch on September 16th, 2018. I did a sermon on why and how Christians should think about voting in the 2016 election. This is the first time I've done a sermon like this at Solomon's Porch, and it was really built around the rationale for what we're doing on the Vote Common Good tour. So I think it's not only fitting for what we're up to at Solomon's Porch, our Christian community in Minneapolis, but I think really helps to frame my thinking for others and why they would engage in Vote Common Good. Hope you enjoy.
Hey all, if I grab your attention for another moment or two, I'd love to do that. I'm going to do a sermon. I'm going to do a sermon tonight. We are making some changes in our gatherings, as I mentioned during the welcome, and I don't know, the future of how we meet is something we're going to all be deciding together about how we do that. If you want to be part of that process, we'll invite you into it. So at some point in the next number of weeks, we'll stop meeting like this and we'll be meeting in some other ways, whether that's 52 weeks or 5 weeks or something. We don't know that yet, but somewhere in that period of time. So I've started calculating, 19 years ago, almost 20 years ago, we started having gatherings like this. And we've been doing lots of kinds of sermons over that period of time. I've read lots of books of the Bible. Tim knows, he keeps track somewhere in a Google spreadsheet how many it is, 41 books of the Bible or something like that. Does that sound about right? We've read out loud as our sermons. We've had 1,000 weeks of meeting together. 1,000 weeks. Some of those weeks we had multiple gatherings. In other words, there's been lots of sermons done in a format like this where I've had the chance to sit on a stool and run the stool of spin on people. And now at some point, we're going to get down to, whatever we do in the future might have some form of something like this, but at least in this format, kind of getting down to the some countable number. So now I'm like, what have I not said that I want to say from the stool of spin? So, hot dog, if you come for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to tell you all the things I was too afraid to tell you before. No, I'm totally kidding. Yeah, that's a great question. We'll have a Q&A at maybe the last gathering. People can ask all the, how do you know the spin pacing? Yeah, it's really hard. There's been a whole trick to it, a subconscious messaging I've been sending by if I turn right or turn left. How fast, if I'm going this way and then I come back this way. If I've ever come back and looked at you twice, there was a message being sent there. A lot of people have missed those, so I want to make that perfectly clear. It's only slightly kidding about that one. I do? You think I'm left leaning? Well, the globe is round, so if you keep going left, you'll just end up right back to where you are. That's a life lesson taught. You end up just on the right of where you were before. No, I'm just kidding. But I do want to do a sermon tonight that has a lot to do with something I'm going to be up to for the next month. I'm helping to lead an effort called Vote Common Good. And Vote Common Good is an intentional barnstorming of the country in a bus and caravan setup where we're going to 30 cities around the country and we're inviting people to engage in the political process on November 6th to flip Congress. And we're explicitly and intentionally structuring and inviting to go after Christians in this country who we think should be voting not their Republican impulse if they have one, but rather voting for the common good for all people. And I want to just take this opportunity in the sermon to talk about why I'm doing that and how that fits. So basically I want to do a sermon on religion and politics, at least how I think about it. I'm a Christian who believes in the teachings. Oh, look at that. How'd you find that? Yeah, anyway, we're doing an event here October 10th that involves those people. Christy and Vince and Mia. Vince and Mia are New York musicians. Frank Schaefer, Nadia Boltz-Weber, me, 2 candidates, a guy named Richard Painter, and a bunch of others are going to join in this event over in Richfield. Love to have you there. Need a bunch of help, a bunch of volunteers, stuff like that. In fact, we need a bunch of volunteers on the 26th and 27th of September as well. A little setup. So if you're interested in helping, you can talk about that. But I'm a Christian who holds to the teachings of Jesus, and the teachings of Jesus don't call someone to be a Republican or a Democrat or a Green Party or an independent. The teachings of Jesus call someone to love God and to love their neighbor and to love themselves with simultaneous energy and in a simultaneous act. Love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. All of those together in simultaneous act of shared commitment. It's not the Christian call that should ask someone to vote for a Democrat. It is the situation on the ground that calls someone to have to put their faith into particular action and to utilize their voting as a tool to bring about the common good for all people, it seems to me. So it is, in my view, the call of my faith and the call of the faith that holds me and that I hold, that I be committed to the common good for all people. I'm someone who likes Jesus' phrase a lot where he says, the time has come, repent and believe the good news. Repent doesn't just mean what street preachers want you to think it means. It means open your eyes or see anew. See anew the good news of God. See the good news that's happening. And so people who hold to the good news, whether it's in the Christian faith or any other kind of faith, seems to me should be compelled because of their belief in the good news of God to care about the common good for all people. And it is their faith that drives them to have to consider what the common good is. And then in any circumstance you find yourself in, whether it's living in the United States and having a political vote to consider, whether it's at your job and having to consider the welfare of your coworkers, whether it's at a care facility and caring about those who are under your care, the drive to consider the common good is always our drive. And the drive to set aside even our own self-interests, if they need to be set aside, for the care of another is what caring about the common good and caring about the good news and being someone who loves God, self, and others in simultaneous action, that you are going to care for another's needs just as you might set aside your own. So there are an awful lot of people who would say, and rightly they should, well, I don't think any of those parties represent my views. It's a great point. They probably don't. I can assure you that for someone like me, I have not yet met a politician who represents my views. I have not met a party that would say things the way I want to and make the commitments that I think need to be made. The point is not that I have found my lifetime partner in a politician or in a political party. The question is, will I use the power I have to influence an outcome for the benefit of those who need it? One question people will ask when they're going to engage in the world is, what's in it for me first? I don't know if that's a bad question. I don't even know if it's the wrong question. I just know it shouldn't be the only question. If you also ask the question, what is it that would help someone else? What's good for others? There's an organization that does this fantastic work. I'm not partnered with them. I have no skin in the game, unlike Vote Common Good. But it's an organization that is doing a national call. You should Google this if this interests you. They're doing a national call for people who don't vote. And they're saying to them, hey, if you don't vote, good for you. Would you, though, consider taking on the issues of people who want to vote but aren't allowed to? And would you be a surrogate to vote on behalf of someone else? Would you vote in their place? Because you don't care about your own opinion being expressed via a vote. Would you carry that weight for someone else who wants to vote? That would include people that have been imprisoned in many states. We have perpetual banning of felons in many states in the United States that prevent people from voting. So they introduce them to a felon and a personal conversation. And that person's allowed to ask them anything they want and to ask the felon, how would you vote on this? And then when they go to the voting booth, they vote on that person's behalf. Or they find someone whose voters' rights have been taken from them for some other reason. Or they're in the country and they don't have the proper documentation that allows them, but they have to live under the effects of people in this country. There's a whole number of reasons why people can't vote. There are children who don't have adults who are thinking about their well-being. So they're kids that are in orphanages or foster homes or other places. So they'll talk to these people and they'll say, what is it that I could do to utilize the tool of my vote in order to affect your life? Now that seems to me to be a particularly Christian thing to do. To think about someone else and to use the power that has been allotted to you in your society to advocate on behalf of someone else. So if you're a non-voter, I'm not going to convince you to vote. In fact, if you don't want to vote, probably don't just walk in and just start willy-nilly voting the way I vote for judges, which is by the person I think has the funniest spelling of their last name. Right? Because I never know what to vote for judges, so I just, come up with something, just check one. So maybe that's not the best way to go. Maybe is to inform yourself by the issues of someone else so you could vote on their behalf. That seems to me to be the kind of thing that someone who's compelled by loving God, themselves, and others that you would want to do. That you wouldn't think about your voting or some political party that you find yourself in or find yourself voting for on occasion or on a regular pattern as the place in which you find your identity. I think that for people to find their identity in a political party is very precarious ground to be on. They tend to change. They tend to only do so much. Our political system is super important. I think it matters so much. It's how we organize at the largest level. Politics is the part of our society in which everybody in a state, everyone in a country is impacted. Every other form of organizing, whether it's communities, businesses, nonprofits, neighborhood clubs, softball teams, they all have a subset of the largest whole. Politics is the largest whole in which we consider everybody. So the question, I think, is incumbent upon a lot of people who care about the good of all, the common good, the good that affects everyone. And it seems to me that every person of faith in Jesus should be asking themselves, can I advocate on behalf of what is really good? Now, that's not always an easy question. What's the good and what's not good? It's really complicated. Sometimes it's not that clear. Sometimes there's two really good choices. Sometimes there's two really good paths. Sometimes what a candidate or a party believes about one thing is really good, and what they think about on another topic is really not so good. So you find yourself stuck in that precarious place. This is one of the reasons that in this country we require age 18 as the minimum voting age. Because the decisions to be made at the political voting level require the kind of thinking that is accessible most normally to people who are 18 years old and older. There are a few who are an exception to that. Some people are 40 and still aren't quite there. Some people are 15 and are already there. But for the most part, 18 sort of suggests that a person can make these difficult decisions. Well, this seems to me to be the very thing that Jesus is talking about. There's this one scene, you might know it from the Gospels if you've ever heard gospel stories. It doesn't come up in a lot of sermons for a whole bunch of reasons, but it's a great story. Some of the religious leaders in the Jewish community at the time of Jesus wanted to push Jesus into a logic corner that would cause him to have to say that what he was doing with the people he was working with, where he was calling them into the good news of God and calling them to live into the fullness of humanity that God has for them. They wanted to put him into a circumstance where he had to say that his movement, this people movement, was in opposition to the government of the day, specifically the government of Caesar, of Rome, in Jerusalem at the time Jesus was living. So some of the Pharisees came up to Jesus and they said, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? It was actually a really great gotcha kind of question. You can imagine why, right? Here Jesus has got a band of people, and those people are feeling the obligation and the pressure and the pain of occupying government force on their lives. They are feeling the kind of hatred in them. They're feeling the kind of angst that just makes their bodies go crazy. And so if Jesus says, yeah, you should fund Caesar, sure, you should fund the very system that's oppressing you. Yes, take your money and give it to your oppressor so they can use it to oppress you. On one hand. On the other hand, if they say to Jesus, what do we do? Do we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus says, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar. Then they can go to Caesar and they can say, well, Jesus is clearly a revolutionary that has political means and a political end, and he wants to bring an end to the reign of Caesar. So Rome, you should attack Jesus. So Jesus' enemies in this religious system, and it wasn't all the religious people, it was a subset, put him in this precarious position. They walk up to him in the middle of a crowd and they say to him, teacher, I have a question for you. And it wasn't one of those deep theological questions like, how do you manage your spin? It was, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus says, give me one of the coins that you that's part of our currency. So they take it and he says, whose picture is on it? Anybody know what the response is? Caesar's picture is on it, right? And what does Jesus say? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. And they were befuddled. Right? Now, look, the Gospels are told in such a way that they're telling the stories in which Jesus looks like he's got an answer for these things, right? That's sort of how it is. But the Christian community keeps that story in there to say, you can have a commitment to Caesar, Jesus' day, and to God. They don't negate one another. You have an obligation, and you have an obligation. If it truly belongs to the political system, give it to the political system. If it truly belongs to God, give it to God. The one thing you don't want to do, I think, reading into Jesus, is to hold back or switch courses. Give to Caesar which belongs to God. I think there's something that matches that in our day. I don't think it's a perfect scenario. I don't think our governmental system is comparable to first century Roman culture. I don't think the faith that we're living right now manifests in the same way in the United States that the faith that Jesus was trying to advocate and live into was manifesting in the first century. I think there's really important differences. And I think there's something that is shared. And that is, you have an obligation to God, if that's part of your faith in your life. Fulfill that obligation. And when that obligation calls you to give something to the common good, to give something to the broader set, to give something to the government, give that as well. Now, doesn't mean it has to be a vote. It can be a whole lot of other things. I don't know. That's the good thing about this country is you get lots of options, you get lots of choices, and nobody should be telling you there's only one way to do it. It's also the good thing about the faith that Jesus advocates for. Nobody should be telling you that there's only one way for you to do it. But I want to encourage you to consider the notion that offering up to the common good is just as valuable as what you offer up to God. It's another one of these scenes where Jesus says, hey, before you go into in their situation, the temple. Now again, we don't have anything like this in modern day Christian religion. There are no temples that are comparable to the temple in the first century that Jesus was at. There's nothing like that. But in that particular situation, Jesus was watching people that would walk into the temple to try to ask for forgiveness in the faith of their forefathers before the priests in the temple. They would do a ceremonial washing, and then they would say some things, and they'd go into the temple, and they would ask for forgiveness. So Jesus says to his disciples, hey, if you're ever there, and you're ready to go in to seek that forgiveness, just double check for a minute and see if there's anything else that you have unsettled with any of the people that are in your life. Is there anyone you should go to first to be sure that you've asked for forgiveness or granted forgiveness or you're reconciled as best you can be? Do that and then fulfill that religious obligation. It feels and sounds actually an awful lot like to God, God's, and to Caesar, Caesar's. In other words, do you have an obligation to another? Fulfill the obligation to the other. And also fulfill your obligation to your faith and to God. Do both of those things. Live in both of those ways. Now, this has been really hard for people in every society to figure out. The Bible is full of stories about just those around Jesus trying to figure this out. At one point, the Roman soldiers come to arrest Jesus, and Peter thinks the best thing to do is to try to cut a man's head open with his sword. So he pulls out a sword and swings at his head and cuts the man's ear off. At which Jesus' response is, put the sword away. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. We're not doing that. In another of the Gospels, he heals the guy's ear. But he says, no. That opposition. Don't fight the way they fight. Love the way we love. So sometimes you have to make a decision. No, don't do it the way that the society or culture is calling you to act, which is in armed rebellion. Instead, live in this other way. And this competition, is it give to God what is God and reconcile with one another before your religious obligation, or is it set aside that cultural religion, that cultural impulse for this greater way that your faith in God calls you? Which is it? That's not easy. Every society has faced it. The early Christians, the mid-century Christians, the 21st century Christians. People have gotten it really in ways that felt really good to them and to others, and they've gotten it in ways that have been a total nightmare and an absolute disaster. So, this is a difficult circumstance to find oneself in. But I think in the 21st century, in the day that we live, where we're living right now, I think, to my sensibilities, about the things that would be about the common good, to do something about this Trump administration and a complicit Republican Congress is not about partisan politics. It's not about being a Democrat or Republican. I have voted for Republicans. I have voted for Republicans to be president. I have voted for Democrats. I'm not on one side or the other as a blanket statement. But I will tell you what is happening right now with the Trump administration and with the Republicans in Congress, the way it treats children, the way it treats refugees and immigrants, the way that it treats the disadvantaged, the way that it treats our overall sense of kindness and goodness, its total commitment, seeming commitment to cruelty, to crassness, and to corruption is something that whether or not you're all pleased with one party or the other, you have a tool at your disposal that can do something to respond to that circumstance. And the way we've decided to organize is that there's certain people in our country that we send off to do a certain job, and then this is going to sound like Schoolhouse Rock for a minute, but you have representatives that go and they form together into parties, and those parties then determine what the agenda is going to be and what laws are passed and what laws are not passed and who become judges and all the rest of it. Now, I could totally see a time in my life when I would be advocating for people to rise up because of their Christian faith and stand against the Democrats because the Democrats have lost their minds and have lost the sense of the common good. And if they continue to do what an administration is doing and they're complicit in it, that it's causing real harm to the well-being of people. I could imagine that circumstance. That circumstance existed in the 1950s and the 1960s when it was the Democrats in the South who were opposed to the civil rights movement. And people had to stand up against the Democrats, and what's happening now is stand up against the Republicans, in my view. Now, if you have another view, you're totally welcome to have that. If you need the stool to spin next week, I'd be glad to give it to you to advocate on that. Fair enough. It's just a tough argument to make. Because I'm not talking about where you are in tax policy. You can think a lot of things about should we pay more taxes, less taxes, regressive taxes, progressive taxes, but nobody wants their tax dollars used to keep 13,000 children in prisons and cages around this country today. Just that alone, you would think. Nobody wants to advocate, to have an administration advocating and defending and lying on behalf of a president that says if you grab them where you want, you can do whatever you want because you're those kinds of people. It is just intolerable to stand up and say there were good people on both sides, and for no one to say anything about it. I don't know what's going on in all of Congress. All I know is stuff doesn't make any sense to anybody. And everybody acts like nothing I can do. Look, maybe you don't think about all this stuff, don't care about politics, don't care about the... Good enough. Maybe you're like me, you think about it a lot, and every day you're kind of getting a little riled up and a little riled up. There's one day of the year you get to do something about it. That's November 6th. Every other day you get to be angsty about it. But one day, in this country, in our system, in our structure, every citizen whose rights have not been taken from them, there's too many for whom they have, But every citizen whose right has not been taken from them is given a tool. Voting is a use of power and tool. It's not a statement of personal identity. I'd encourage us to consider that we can use our tools for the benefit of kids, of decency, of a lack of corruption, and to act in this world. I know I'm a little hot-headed about all this, so you don't at all need to be as hot-headed as I am about it. But we're living in one of those times where we're going to ask ourselves, what did we do during that time? I don't know if you've seen, there used to be a guy who had a TV show named David Letterman a long time ago. You might have never heard of him. And then he has a TV show on now called My Next Guest. It's a Netflix show called My Next Guest Needs No Introduction. He did an interview with Barack Obama just after Barack Obama left his job. And they were talking about the march in Selma in 1964. John Lewis, the congressman, led that march, and that's the Sunday Bloody Sunday, if you know your old, what's that band called? Yeah, U2, I always forget. That U2 band, that's just my U2 joke. It was a really big day. They were beaten on the stage, dogs were sent after him, John Lewis had his head broken open. They talked about how important this is. David Letterman said to Barack Obama, he said, you know what, I looked back at my schedule, and I was in college when that happened. And I went on a cruise with a bunch of friends that week. And we got totally, college drunk on a cruise. I had no idea it was even happening. How is it possible that all of that was happening and I had no idea? And then how do I get to be the luckiest guy in the world that's been this rich and this famous, and I had no idea that was even going on? David Letterman says this to Barack Obama. It's a really touching moment right at the end of that episode. We probably all have those times where someone tells us about that thing that's super important, and we're like, yeah, seriously, I don't know. I didn't think about that stuff. I didn't know. When I was in college, apartheid in South Africa was a really big deal. A lot of people were really concerned about it. Where's Tessa? She's with the kids. Tessa, when she did her training on anti-racism, talked about how as a kid she was all tied up in the apartheid, bringing an end to apartheid in South Africa. I was in college, barely knew anything about it. Heard the word, never thought a second about it. Totally missed one of the great global injustices. I don't know where this current circumstance in the United States sits. But from my vantage point, this is one of those moments that people are going to look back, and some people are going to say, I felt so privileged to be engaged and be woke and paying attention during that time. And some others of us and kids that are going to say, like, Mom, Dad, Auntie, Uncle, what was that like? What did you do? How did people talk about this? What were your thoughts? Now, I'm not saying any of that to guilt you into acting, because there's no vote that's worth you being guilted into doing something you don't want to do. There's no action that's worth doing something you don't want to do. Just inviting you to consider that it could be of that level of significance and importance, the age that we live in right now. And this could be one of those seminal moments. I don't think this is partisan politics as usual. There's going to be plenty of time for that. I think there is a serious, serious statement being made in people's well-being that's really in jeopardy. And our system has one resolution to this. It is not assassination. It is not impeachment. It is not the 25th Amendment. Our one response to this is to limit the president's actions by having a Congress that will oppose him, and then to have someone else elected to that office. That is our call. I will just say, if any of the rest of those things happen, the system has broken down. My own view. I do think he's going to be impeached, and I think we're going to have to be talking about that being a big other problem, but that is a failure of our system when that happens, and he failed the system if he's done things that are impeachable. All right, that's it. That's my Jesus to November 6th. I think only political sermon. Do you think? I mean, they all have a political edge, but not a politics and vote.
Yeah.
Oh, that you've heard. Tim's a hedger. All right. Anybody else? I always try to give you a chance for a pushback, a comment. No, sir. I don't know if you remember, you were in a meeting. We had a meeting one time, and I was saying a bunch of stuff, and the guy stood up and said, "No, sir." It was the greatest moment of all sermons. Every sermon should either be met with a "No, sir, I'm not sure about that." Wouldn't exactly say it like that. And occasionally a snap or an amen. But all right, so little ones are back. So fun time's over. But anybody with a last comment? Josh, you had a hand up?
I'm just going to let you know what Josh's statement in question was. He was basically asking, what will our approach be on the Vote Common Good tour for trying to help people change their minds? He was reflecting on a news story that he heard where the pastor in Texas had blamed the parents of the children who were locked up in immigration cages for the parents making a decision to bring them to the country, and was saying that the pastor was arguing that the parents made a mistake and their kids are paying the price for it. And he said, how do you essentially change someone's mind like that? And then I give a response to that question.
Yeah, I'd be glad. Can we chat about that? I'll just say a sentence now, and then we can chat about that after, because I know we're running long, because the sermon was really long. I do it in two ways. One, I try to know people that I love who think differently than I do on this, and first of all, get myself into that same empathetic spot that I feel like others are not in. Helps me to not be so snidely and judgy about it. Secondly, I have no interest in trying to change anyone's mind. I've been a preacher for a long time, and one thing I know is it's really hard to change anybody's mind, especially by saying stuff. What I want to do is encourage people who know what good is, because they know the good news, so they know what good is, and they know what's no good. I want them to act on that faith around what is good, and to put an end to the no good. And if they think that that's good, Jesus had this great phrase about, knock the dust off your feet in their town, leave everything there, don't disturb anything, just leave it be. There's another story going on that's not your problem to solve. So I'm glad to talk more about it, but those two things. I want to know people and live in empathy. And secondly, I'm not trying to convince anybody's mind. I'm trying to inspire the hearts of people that are already convinced, and they want a community of people to surround them to join them.